Born in 1897 in the harsh Sicilian town of Lercara, Lucky Luciano entered a world defined by sulfur mines, poverty, and rigid social hierarchy. Life there was not romantic or mysterious. It was brutal and predictable. Children learned early that survival depended on strength, family loyalty, and silence. Authority figures were distant, corrupt, or feared, while informal power networks quietly decided who ate and who starved. This environment shaped Luciano's earliest understanding of control. Power did not come from laws, but from fear, access, and organization. Even as a child, he observed how men with no official titles still commanded absolute obedience. These early impressions would later resurface in how he structured criminal power, not as chaos, but as a system. By the early 1900s, Luciano's family faced a familiar Sicilian dilemma: stay and slowly disappear, or leave everything behind. The decision to emigrate was not hopeful. It was desperate. America was not imagined as freedom, but as opportunity through struggle. The journey itself was traumatic. Overcrowded ships, illness, fear, and uncertainty. For young Luciano, this passage marked his first true break with tradition. Sicily's ancient codes were left behind on the dock, replaced by an unknown future. This physical movement across the ocean planted a mental shift that would later define him. Identity was flexible, loyalty negotiable, and survival required adaptation, not nostalgia. New York's Lower East Side was nothing like Sicily, yet strangely familiar. Crowded tenements replaced stone villages. Street noise replaced rural silence. Crime, poverty, and ambition lived door to door. Here, ethnic groups competed for space, influence, and income. Luciano quickly learned that American streets had their own rules, more chaotic, but full of opportunity. Unlike Sicily, power here could be seized by outsiders willing to organize, intimidate, and think ahead. The city did not care about lineage. It rewarded efficiency. This realization marked the true beginning of Luciano's transformation. Not yet a criminal mastermind, but a boy absorbing a new urban logic where order could be manufactured by those bold enough to impose it. In New York, formal education quickly proved irrelevant to survival. Luciano attended school briefly, but the classroom offered no protection from hunger, bullying, or humiliation. The streets, however, offered lessons that mattered immediately. Who controlled which corner, how territory shifted, and how fear worked faster than fists. Dropping out of school was not rebellion, it was a strategic move. The city educated him in a harsher curriculum where observation mattered more than obedience. He learned to read faces, sense weakness, and recognize opportunity in chaos. These skills formed the foundation of his later leadership style: pragmatic, unsentimental, and always focused on results rather than appearances. Luciano's first income did not come from theft alone, but from control. He organized small groups of boys who demanded pennies from weaker kids in exchange for protection. This was not random cruelty. It was an early experiment in structured extortion. He learned that people would pay not for safety, but for predictability. Violence was used sparingly. Reputation did most of the work. This period revealed a key insight that never left him. Fear is most effective when it is organized and consistent. The street became a laboratory where he tested authority on a small scale, refining techniques he would later apply to entire criminal networks. Encounters with police were frequent, but educational. Luciano observed that law enforcement presence did not equal control. Some officers were aggressive, others indifferent, some quietly corrupt. Rules bent depending on who paid, who knew whom, and who caused inconvenience. From this, he learned boundaries, how far one could push without consequences. The idea that authority could be negotiated rather than obeyed reshaped his worldview. Power, he realized, was fragmented, and fragmented systems could be exploited. By age 15, Luciano understood something many adults never grasped. The city ran not on law, but on managed compromise. The Five Points district of Manhattan was not merely a neighborhood, it was a pressure cooker, where crime, immigration, and ambition collided daily. Narrow streets twisted between decaying buildings, creating blind corners perfect for ambush, escape, or secret meetings. Ethnic enclaves overlapped without blending, producing constant tension but also opportunity. Italians, Irish, Jews, and others competed for the same underground markets: gambling, theft, fencing stolen goods, and street-level violence for hire. For a young Luciano, 5 Points functioned as a living map of power dynamics. He observed how gangs rose and fell, not based on brutality alone, but on organization, alliances, and access to money. Unlike earlier neighborhood hustles, 5 Points introduced Luciano to interconnected crime. Gambling dens were linked to loan sharks. Pickpockets fed fences. Fences paid enforcers. Every role depended on another. This ecosystem revealed a truth that would later define modern organized crime. Violence was only one tool in a much larger machine. The real winners were those who coordinated flows of cash, information, and protection. Luciano noticed that the most powerful figures were rarely the loudest or most feared. They were calm, well-dressed, and insulated, letting others take risks while they managed outcomes. Social clubs and backroom cafes served as informal offices. Conversations happened in fragments, coded glances, pauses. Trust was temporary, betrayal constant. Watching this environment sharpened Luciano's instincts. He learned patience, restraint, and the value of neutrality in volatile spaces. Rather than pledging blind loyalty to any one gang, he positioned himself as adaptable, useful to many, owned by none. 5 Points did not teach him how to fight. It taught him how to structure chaos, a lesson that would later allow him to dismantle old criminal traditions and replace them with something far more efficient and far more dangerous. By his mid-teens, Luciano had already crossed an invisible line separating petty survival from deliberate criminal identity. What distinguished him from dozens of other street toughs was not aggression, but consistency. He was arrested multiple times for minor offenses: assault, theft, weapons possession, but these encounters were less setbacks than rehearsals. Each arrest taught him how the system reacted, how paperwork slowed justice, how intimidation worked in both directions. He noticed that police treated repeat offenders differently, not with fear, but with expectation. That expectation itself became leverage. Luciano understood that predictability could be weaponized. If authorities assumed a certain level of crime, anything beyond it could be hidden more easily. Reputation on the street did not spread through newspapers. It traveled mouth to mouth. Luciano's name began circulating as someone who kept his word, a rare trait in volatile neighborhoods. If he promised protection, it happened. If he threatened consequences, they followed swiftly but efficiently. Violence was precise, not emotional. This created a paradoxical safety around him. Chaos increased everywhere else but stabilized near his operations. That stability attracted followers, gamblers, and small operators seeking order in disorder. Luciano was no longer just reacting to the street, he was shaping it. Crucially, he avoided unnecessary visibility. While others chased notoriety, Luciano cultivated controlled presence. He dressed carefully, spoke less than peers, and let others perform the violence. Early on, he grasped a principle that would define his career. The most dangerous man in the room is rarely the loudest. By the time he reached his early 20s, Luciano had achieved something rare. He was feared without being famous. His arrests built a shadow resume, signaling resilience rather than weakness. This phase marked the quiet birth of a criminal executive mindset, where image, restraint, and structure mattered more than brute force. The meeting between Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky marked a decisive shift in the logic of American organized crime. Where Luciano brought street authority, intimidation, and instinct, Lansky brought mathematics, discipline, and long-term thinking. Their alliance was not emotional or ethnic, it was practical. At a time when criminal groups were divided along rigid cultural lines, their partnership quietly proved that profit functioned better than prejudice. They shared a belief that violence was a tool, not a lifestyle, and that predictable income mattered more than dramatic confrontations. Lansky introduced Luciano to a colder way of seeing crime: numbers instead of impulses, margins instead of revenge. Gambling operations became testing grounds for this philosophy. Losses were calculated, not blamed. Wins were reinvested, not flaunted. Together, they reduced risk by spreading operations across locations and people, insulating leadership from exposure. This approach contrasted sharply with older bosses who relied on personal loyalty and constant intimidation. Luciano absorbed these lessons quickly. He learned that fear could open doors, but systems kept them open. Equally important was trust. In an environment where betrayal was routine, their cooperation endured because it was mutually reinforcing. Luciano protected Lansky from street-level threats. Lansky protected Luciano from financial blind spots. Decisions were discussed privately, executed quietly, and evaluated without sentiment. This partnership laid the groundwork for a new criminal culture, one that favored meetings over shootouts, accounting over chaos. It also demonstrated a revolutionary idea for its time. Organized crime could be run like a business, with executives, managers, and operators performing distinct roles. By the end of this phase, Luciano was no longer just a powerful figure in a neighborhood ecosystem. With Lansky, he began thinking in networks, not blocks, an evolution that would soon collide violently with the old-world bosses still clinging to tradition. By the early 1920s, New York's criminal world no longer resembled scattered street gangs fighting over scraps. It had evolved into a layered underground economy with specialization, delegation, and informal hierarchies. This period was crucial for Luciano's development because it exposed him to crime as infrastructure, not impulse. Every illegal activity, gambling, prostitution, theft rings, loan sharking, was interconnected. Money flowed upward, risk flowed downward. Street-level operators absorbed arrests and violence, while organizers remained insulated, mobile, and difficult to trace. Luciano studied this separation carefully, recognizing that survival depended on staying one step removed from the visible crime. What defined this era was scalability. Gambling rooms multiplied across neighborhoods, each feeding a central bankroll. Prostitutes worked fixed routes under rotating protection teams. Stolen goods moved through fences who never met the thieves. The system thrived because no single arrest could dismantle it. Luciano understood that whoever coordinated these moving parts, not necessarily the toughest fighter, held real power. He began placing loyal intermediaries between himself and daily operations, testing early versions of a command structure that mimicked legitimate enterprises. Decisions were centralized, consequences were distributed. Territory still mattered, but ideology mattered less. Money erased old boundaries. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and other groups increasingly collaborated when profit aligned, even as violence flared where interests collided. Luciano observed which alliances lasted and which collapsed under ego. He learned that predictable income created stability, while constant warfare drained resources and attention. This insight pushed him further away from traditional notions of honor and closer to functional pragmatism. Loyalty became conditional. Respect was earned through reliability, not ancestry. This marketplace also introduced Luciano to time as a weapon. Delays, patience, and waiting for the right moment often produced better outcomes than immediate retaliation. Watching rivals self-destruct through impulsive violence reinforced his belief that the future belonged to those who could manage people, not just intimidate them. By the end of this phase, Luciano had fully absorbed the lesson that crime, when organized efficiently, could mirror corporate behavior, anticipating supply, managing demand, and minimizing exposure. The underworld was no longer a battleground alone. It was a business environment, and Luciano was learning to operate as an executive within it. The enactment of Prohibition in 1920 did not create crime. It reorganized it overnight. When alcohol was outlawed, demand did not disappear. It multiplied. What changed was scale. Liquor was no longer a neighborhood vice but a national commodity, and supplying it required logistics, capital, protection, and coordination across cities. For Luciano, Prohibition was not a moral debate. It was an economic earthquake. Small-time operators were crushed by the costs and risks, while organized groups capable of coordination surged ahead. Crime ceased to be reactive and became anticipatory, planning months ahead instead of surviving day to day. Bootlegging demanded infrastructure, docks for import, warehouses for storage, fleets of vehicles for distribution, and armed escorts to secure shipments. Luciano immediately understood that violence alone could not sustain such complexity. Missed deliveries meant losses. Sloppy operations attracted attention. He pushed for discipline and compartmentalization, ensuring that no single participant could expose the whole chain. Drivers didn't know suppliers. Guards didn't know financiers. This structure mirrored legitimate supply chains, making disruption difficult and expensive for authorities. Prohibition forced criminals to think like logisticians, and Luciano thrived in that environment. Equally transformative was geography. Alcohol routes ignored ethnic boundaries and local loyalties. Whiskey from Canada, rum from the Caribbean, wine from domestic producers, all converged through ports and rail lines. This required cooperation between groups that previously viewed each other as enemies. Luciano favored deals over feuds, recognizing that predictable profit beat territorial pride. He observed that violence now threatened margins, not just lives. Each gunshot increased scrutiny. Each unnecessary conflict endangered shipments. As a result, restraint became a strategic advantage. By embracing Prohibition's realities, Luciano accelerated away from traditional street bosses still trapped in neighborhood thinking. He grasped that the future of organized crime lay not in controlling corners, but in controlling flows of goods, money, and information. Prohibition did not just enrich him, it validated his belief that crime could be systematized, scaled, and stabilized. This period marked the irreversible shift from local gang dominance to national criminal enterprise, setting the stage for inevitable conflict with old-world leaders unable or unwilling to adapt. As Prohibition profits surged, Luciano shifted focus from street enforcement to distribution intelligence. He understood that alcohol itself was not the product, reliability was. Customers paid for consistency, the same quality, the same timing, the same discretion. To deliver that, Luciano helped engineer layered routes that mimicked commercial supply chains. Shipments arrived through multiple entry points, were split into smaller loads, and moved through temporary storage to avoid patterns. Nothing stayed long in one place. The goal was not speed alone, but opacity, making it impossible for authorities to see the whole picture even if they intercepted a piece of it. This phase emphasized redundancy. Every route had alternatives, every driver had a replacement, every warehouse had a secondary location. Luciano favored planning for failure rather than denying it. Losses were anticipated and absorbed as operational costs. This thinking marked a decisive break from older bosses who relied on intimidation to solve problems. Luciano treated setbacks analytically. What failed? Why? How to prevent repetition? Violence was reserved for breaches of trust or threats to the network, not as an emotional response to disruption. Coordination meetings became quieter and more deliberate. Instructions were passed verbally, often indirectly, minimizing written evidence. Middlemen handled schedules. Enforcers handled security. Accountants tracked flows without touching product. This separation of functions reduced exposure and increased resilience. Luciano also encouraged cooperation across neighborhoods and cities, sharing routes and profits to prevent bottlenecks. Rival groups were offered participation rather than exclusion, transforming potential enemies into stakeholders. This reduced conflict while expanding reach. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano learned that time could conceal crime better than force. Delayed retaliation, staggered deliveries, and patient negotiations kept operations invisible. While police chased raids and arrests, the real machinery adjusted silently. By the end of this period, Luciano was no longer managing crews. He was overseeing systems. His power grew not from visibility, but from indispensability. Those who depended on the network protected it instinctively, because dismantling it would collapse their own income. The underworld had begun to function like an industry, and Luciano was helping design its operating manual. By the late 1920s, a deep ideological fracture split the underworld. On one side stood the old guard, bosses rooted in old-world customs, rigid hierarchies, and personal authority. Their power depended on ritual, lineage, and unquestioned obedience. Meetings followed formal codes. Decisions were slow. Loyalty was demanded rather than earned. On the other side emerged a new breed of operators, younger, pragmatic, and business-minded. They valued efficiency over tradition, alliances over ancestry, and profit over pride. This clash was not immediately violent, but it was irreconcilable. Luciano aligned decisively with the modernists. He observed that the old bosses treated crime as inherited territory, while the new generation treated it as a market. The old guard believed fear alone guaranteed control. The new breed understood that fear without stability destroyed revenue. Traditional leaders punished dissent harshly, creating paranoia and encouraging betrayal. Modern operators incentivized cooperation, creating systems that rewarded reliability. Luciano saw that the old model could not scale nationally. It collapsed under its own rigidity. Tension surfaced in subtle ways. Stalled negotiations, blocked routes, denied partnerships. Younger crews were restricted not because they failed, but because they threatened established authority. This produced quiet resentment that spread across neighborhoods. Luciano recognized the danger of open rebellion and instead practiced strategic patience. He built parallel alliances, strengthened logistics, and ensured that when confrontation came, it would be decisive rather than chaotic. He understood that wars of succession were rarely won by the loudest contender, but by the one who controlled supply, loyalty, and timing. This period was defined by anticipation. Everyone sensed that violence was coming, but no one knew when. The old guard tightened control. The new breed expanded influence quietly. Luciano positioned himself as a bridge, respectful to tradition publicly, subversive privately. By the end of this minute, the underworld stood on the edge of transformation. What followed would not be a simple gang conflict, but a structural collapse of one system and the birth of another. The war ahead would decide not just who ruled, but how crime itself would be organized. At the center of the old guard's power structure stood Joe Masseria, a figure who embodied traditional authority in American organized crime. His rule was built on centralized control. Tribute flowed upward, orders flowed downward, and dissent was met with immediate punishment. Masseria believed stability came from fear and visibility. He hosted lavish gatherings, demanded public loyalty, and reinforced hierarchy through ritual. To many older bosses, this model felt familiar and secure. To younger operators like Luciano, it looked increasingly fragile. Masseria's system depended on personal dominance. Decisions bottlenecked at the top, slowing responses to rapidly changing conditions created by Prohibition. Profitable routes were restricted not by logic, but by favoritism. Capable younger figures were blocked from advancement to prevent challenges to authority. This created inefficiency and resentment. Luciano observed that Masseria confused obedience with loyalty. Men complied outwardly but quietly searched for alternatives. Fear kept the structure intact, but it also hollowed it out from within. Another weakness lay in visibility. Masseria enjoyed being seen as the ultimate power, at restaurants, social clubs, and public gatherings. This exposure fed his ego but increased risk. Law enforcement attention grew, and rivals mapped his habits carefully. Luciano recognized that Masseria's strength was also his liability, a single, identifiable center of gravity. In contrast, Luciano's emerging philosophy favored distributed power, where no single blow could collapse the whole system. Despite these flaws, Masseria was not careless. He commanded real loyalty from traditionalists and controlled significant territory and manpower. Challenging him openly would have been suicide. Luciano therefore adopted a dual posture, publicly respectful, privately skeptical. He continued paying tribute while quietly strengthening alliances beyond Masseria's reach. This minute marks a critical tension point. The old boss still ruled, but the foundations of his authority were eroding. The question was no longer if the system would break, but who would control the moment it did. By the end of the 1920s, the tension between competing power blocks could no longer be contained. What began as ideological rivalry hardened into the Castellamarese War, a brutal struggle defined less by territory than by survival. Assassinations replaced negotiations. Trust evaporated. Every meeting carried the risk of betrayal. The city's underworld fractured into armed camps aligned either with Masseria or Maranzano, and neutrality became impossible. For many lower-level operators, the war was incomprehensible. Alliances shifted overnight, orders contradicted yesterday's truths, and violence felt random. In reality, it followed a cold internal logic. Luciano did not rush to the front lines. Instead, he watched patterns emerge. Hits were not impulsive. They were targeted to destabilize chains of command. Removing a lieutenant caused confusion. Eliminating a coordinator collapsed entire crews. Luciano noted which side adapted faster and which clung to ritual. Maranzano's followers emphasized obedience and ceremony. Masseria's relied on personal loyalty. Both models showed cracks under sustained pressure. The war exposed a fatal flaw shared by both camps. Too much depended on individual bosses. Street violence surged. Drive-by shootings, ambushes outside cafes, sudden disappearances. Yet behind the chaos, quieter calculations unfolded. Routes were cut, cash flows disrupted, and protection withdrawn to force compliance. Luciano understood that wars were not won by body counts alone, but by exhaustion. Men grew paranoid, mistakes multiplied, and morale collapsed. He deliberately conserved resources, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed while preparing for a decisive shift. This phase transformed Luciano's role. He became less a participant and more a broker of outcomes, communicating selectively, testing loyalties, and identifying who could be trusted once the dust settled. The war clarified a harsh truth. The existing order was unsustainable. Too many men were dying for systems that could not survive modern pressures. As bodies accumulated and profits stalled, the appetite for radical change grew. The Castellamarese War did not just kill people, it killed the credibility of the old models. And in that vacuum, Luciano prepared to act. As the Castellamarese War intensified, Lucky Luciano shifted into a mode that defined his entire career: anticipatory survival. While others reacted emotionally to losses, Luciano focused on outcomes. He recognized that both factions were bleeding resources and credibility, and that loyalty driven by fear collapsed under sustained pressure. His goal was no longer victory for a side, but survival beyond the war. This required emotional detachment, selective silence, and an ability to see allies and enemies as temporary states rather than fixed identities. Luciano began quietly mapping people, not factions. Who adapted under stress? Who panicked? Who followed orders blindly, and who thought independently? These observations mattered more than ideology. He reduced exposure, avoided predictable routines, and limited face-to-face meetings. Messages traveled through intermediaries, decisions were delayed until patterns clarified. Where others saw chaos, Luciano saw data. Every hit revealed information about priorities, fears, and weaknesses. He learned which men could be trusted after the war, and which would become liabilities. This period also hardened his belief that centralized authority was fatal. Watching bosses issue rigid commands while conditions shifted convinced him that flexibility was the true advantage. He prepared for a future without boss of bosses, imagining a system where power was distributed, disputes arbitrated, and violence regulated. This was not idealism, it was efficiency born of necessity. The war demonstrated that emotional leadership produced instability, while structured cooperation promised longevity. Luciano's restraint attracted attention. Some mistook it for weakness, others recognized calculation. Quietly, channels opened. Men from both sides tested his reliability, sensing that the war's end would require a mediator capable of redesigning the landscape. Luciano neither confirmed nor denied anything. He waited. By the end of this minute, his position was clear. He was no longer fighting to win the war as it existed. He was preparing to end it by replacing the system that caused it. After surviving the beating, Lucky Luciano reached a conclusion that separated him permanently from every other contender of his era. The war itself was a symptom, not the disease. Killing rivals would not solve the underlying problem, because the structure that produced conflict would simply generate new enemies. What had to be destroyed was not just Masseria or Maranzano, but the idea of absolute personal rule. Luciano began designing something unprecedented in American organized crime, a system meant to regulate power rather than concentrate it. This planning phase unfolded quietly and deliberately. Luciano avoided grand meetings and avoided revealing intent. Instead, he held fragmented conversations, testing reactions without exposing the full vision. The proposal, when hinted at, was radical: no single boss of bosses, no inherited supremacy, no emotional vendettas disguised as honor. In its place would be a shared governing body where major families retained autonomy but submitted disputes to arbitration. Violence would not disappear, but it would become controlled, used only when rules were violated. The objective was stability, not peace. Luciano also understood that ideology alone could not end the war. Incentives would. He framed the new order in practical terms. Fewer wars meant fewer arrests. Fewer arrests meant more profit. More profit meant loyalty without terror. He appealed not to tradition, but to self-interest. Men exhausted by years of fear and funerals began to listen. Importantly, Luciano never presented himself as the ruler of this future system. He positioned himself as a facilitator, someone willing to give up symbolic dominance in exchange for long-term survival. This humility was strategic, not moral. Another critical element was timing. Luciano waited until both factions were weakened enough to accept change, but not so desperate as to lash out blindly. He studied personalities, identifying who could adapt and who would resist any loss of supremacy. The latter would not be negotiated with. They would be removed. By the end of this minute, the blueprint was complete. What remained was execution. Swift, precise, and irreversible. The next moves would end the war, not with a treaty, but with a restructuring of power itself, redefining how the American Mafia would operate for decades. The decision to eliminate Joe Masseria was not driven by vengeance. It was procedural. By 1931, Masseria's command structure had become the primary obstacle to ending the war. His authority centralized fear but blocked adaptation. Luciano concluded that removing Masseria would not ignite chaos if, and only if, the transition was tightly controlled. The operation was designed to be swift, discreet, and psychologically decisive, signaling that the old rules no longer applied. Luciano's genius lay in delegation and distance. He arranged circumstances without placing himself at the center. Trust was extended to a small, reliable circle. Roles were compartmentalized. The setting, a familiar restaurant environment, was chosen precisely because it lowered suspicion. Routine disarmed caution. When the moment arrived, the action was fast and impersonal. There was no spectacle, no message carved into the act. The point was not intimidation, it was finality. What mattered most came immediately after. Luciano moved to contain shock, ensuring that Masseria's removal did not fracture operations or trigger retaliatory spirals. Key figures were reassured. Revenue streams were stabilized. Violence was paused. This demonstrated a principle Luciano had been testing for years. Removing a leader did not have to destabilize a system if the system was already prepared to operate without him. In contrast, Masseria's rule had depended entirely on his presence. Once gone, it collapsed cleanly. The hit also served as proof of concept. It showed allies and skeptics alike that Luciano's approach, quiet planning, limited violence, structural thinking, worked. The underworld took notice. Fear shifted away from personal wrath and toward inevitability. Power was no longer about who shouted loudest or punished fastest, but about who could shape outcomes without being seen. By the end of this minute, one pillar of the old order was gone. The war was not yet over, but its direction had irreversibly changed. What remained was the final confrontation with tradition itself. With the old world hierarchy dismantled, Lucky Luciano moved quickly to prevent a vacuum. His solution was neither a truce nor a takeover, but a governing mechanism. The creation of the commission formalized what had previously been improvised: collective decision-making among major crime families. This body was not symbolic. It functioned as an arbitration panel, allocating territories, approving leadership changes, and, most critically, regulating violence. Hits without authorization became violations, punishable by the collective. The message was clear. Individual ambition would no longer endanger shared profit. The Commission's design reflected lessons learned during the war. Power was distributed, not concentrated. No single figure could dictate outcomes unilaterally. Each major family retained autonomy within its domain, but agreed to submit disputes to the council. This reduced impulsive retaliation and replaced vendettas with negotiation. Importantly, the system rewarded predictability. Stable income streams mattered more than dramatic displays of dominance. By institutionalizing restraint, the Commission transformed crime from a series of personal feuds into a managed enterprise. Parallel to this, New York's landscape was stabilized through recognition of the five families framework. Rather than endless boundary disputes, each family's sphere of influence was acknowledged and protected. This did not eliminate competition. It channeled it. Expansion required consensus. Leadership changes required approval. The result was fewer wars, fewer arrests at the top, and longer planning horizons. Younger operators saw a future worth investing in. Older ones accepted limits in exchange for survival. Crucially, Luciano refused ceremonial supremacy. He declined any title resembling boss of bosses, reinforcing the system's credibility. Authority now resided in process, not personality. This decision ensured continuity beyond any single leader's lifespan. The underworld had, for the first time, rules that applied to everyone, including its architects. By the end of these 2 minutes, American organized crime had crossed a threshold. It was no longer defined by who ruled, but by how decisions were made. The system would evolve, fracture, and face pressure, but it would endure, precisely because it was designed to outlast the men who built it. With the Commission established in New York, its logic quickly extended beyond city limits. Organized crime became national by necessity, not ambition. Bootlegging routes crossed state lines. Gambling money flowed between cities. Labor influence stretched across ports and rail hubs. Luciano and his peers understood that local stability meant little without external coordination. Rivalries between cities had previously produced costly conflicts. The new approach replaced confrontation with intercity negotiation, allowing profits to scale without drawing federal attention. Representatives acted as envoys rather than war leaders, exchanging information, settling disputes, and aligning interests quietly. This expansion demanded a new discipline: invisibility. Luciano promoted a sharp divide between public appearance and private authority. Leaders avoided flamboyance, reduced public presence, and cultivated ordinary routines. The goal was to blend into the background of American life: restaurants, apartments, offices, never appearing exceptional. Visibility invited scrutiny. Anonymity preserved control. This philosophy marked a departure from earlier bosses who equated respect with recognition. Luciano understood that power functioned best when unnoticed. National coordination also required trust mechanisms. Personal friendships were insufficient across distances, so procedural trust replaced emotional bonds. Agreements were standardized, expectations clarified, consequences defined. This reduced misunderstandings and limited the need for enforcement. Violence became a last resort, not a communication tool. When disputes arose, they were escalated through intermediaries rather than settled on the street. This structure lowered risk while preserving authority. Publicly, figures like Luciano appeared increasingly mundane, businesslike, restrained, almost dull. Privately, influence deepened. Decisions made in quiet hotel rooms or private apartments reshaped entire regional markets. This dual existence protected leadership while confusing law enforcement, which still searched for dramatic kingpins rather than distributed networks. The system's strength lay in its refusal to look like power at all. By the end of these minutes, American organized crime had mastered a critical survival skill: operating in plain sight without being seen. The underworld no longer needed legends or symbols. It relied on routine, procedure, and silence. This transformation did not make crime less harmful. It made it harder to confront. And in that invisibility, the system found durability that brute force alone could never provide. World War II transformed the American waterfront from a criminal asset into a national security concern. Ports became arteries of war production, vulnerable to sabotage, strikes, and disruption. Federal authorities faced a paradox. The very networks they had spent years dismantling still controlled labor flows, informal discipline, and local intelligence along the docks. From prison, Lucky Luciano remained symbolically connected to these environments, not through command, but through reputation. The state understood that influence persisted even without direct control. This period introduced one of the most controversial episodes in Luciano's legacy: conditional cooperation. Authorities sought stability more than allegiance. The arrangement was pragmatic rather than ideological, reduced interference in exchange for labor peace and information flow. For Luciano, it confirmed a long-held belief: systems endure because they are useful, even to those who oppose them. He did not regain freedom through dominance, but through relevance. The underworld watched closely, noting that even imprisonment did not fully erase leverage when networks intersected with state interests. The bargain, however, carried a cost. Luciano's release was paired with permanent deportation. The decision was surgical: remove the man without dismantling the structure outright. For the state, it avoided martyrdom while neutralizing a focal point. For Luciano, it was exile disguised as mercy. He left the United States stripped of territory, cut off from the environment he understood best. The streets that shaped him were now inaccessible. Italy was no refuge. Post-war surveillance was constant, mobility restricted, and influence monitored. Luciano attempted to re-establish relevance through distance, but geography mattered. Power built on proximity weakened abroad. These minutes capture a profound reversal. A figure who mastered invisibility was rendered visible by borders. The system he helped design continued without him, proving its resilience, and underscoring the ultimate irony of organized power. Structures survive, adapt, and persist, while individuals are displaced, managed, or removed. Luciano's story entered its final phase, not command, but consequence. By the late 1940s, American popular culture began feeding on the shadow it only partially understood. Gangsters appeared on cinema screens as exaggerated figures, stylish, decisive, larger than life. These portrayals borrowed fragments of reality, but reshaped them into spectacle. Ironically, the system influenced by Lucky Luciano rejected spectacle entirely. While films glamorized visibility, real power had already learned to survive through restraint. This feedback loop distorted public perception, turning organized crime into myth while obscuring its bureaucratic nature. The more Hollywood dramatized violence, the less attention was paid to the quiet mechanisms that actually sustained criminal enterprises. Meanwhile, Luciano's own life in Italy grew increasingly narrow. Authorities maintained continuous surveillance, not because he acted overtly, but because he symbolized potential disruption. Police presence became routine, outside residences, near cafes, along travel routes. Every interaction was noted. This scrutiny drained spontaneity from daily life. Conversations shortened. Visitors hesitated. Luciano existed in a state of permanent observation, where even inactivity carried suspicion. The environment reinforced a truth he had long understood intellectually, but now experienced personally. Systems tolerate individuals only while they remain useful or controllable. As myth expanded abroad and surveillance tightened at home, Luciano's private world contracted. Relationships suffered under the weight of distance and mistrust. Romantic connections were strained by uncertainty. Friendships faded as relevance declined. The emotional cost of decades spent prioritizing structure over intimacy became unavoidable. Decisions once justified by efficiency now echoed as absence. Power had provided insulation, but also isolation. These minutes expose a rarely examined dimension of organized crime leadership: loneliness as consequence. Luciano had minimized emotional dependence to survive volatile environments, yet that same discipline left little comfort when influence waned. He observed his own legacy being reshaped by storytellers, while he remained constrained by reality. The contrast was stark. On screen, gangsters ruled rooms. In life, Luciano navigated routine under watchful eyes. By this stage, his role was neither commander nor conspirator, but observer, watching a system evolve beyond him and a myth grow louder than the man himself. Power had become narrative elsewhere, while his own existence narrowed to habit, memory, and control without command. By the early 1960s, Lucky Luciano was no longer a figure of action, but of consequence. His health deteriorated steadily. Heart problems, fatigue, and the cumulative weight of years spent under stress and surveillance. Attempts to engage in legitimate business ventures failed not because of lack of skill, but because legitimacy requires visibility, and visibility was precisely what authorities denied him. Every move was scrutinized, every partnership discouraged. The transition from architect of systems to constrained individual was complete. Criticism of Luciano intensified after his operational influence ended. Prosecutors, journalists, and even former associates reframed his legacy to suit their needs. To some, he was the mastermind behind all modern organized crime. To others, a parasite who merely benefited from larger trends. The truth lay in between. Luciano neither invented crime nor controlled it absolutely. What he did was accelerate a transformation from emotional, personality-driven violence to structured, procedural governance. That distinction mattered. It explained why the system endured long after he no longer mattered personally. In 1962, Luciano died quietly in Naples. There was no dramatic ending, no final command. His death was administrative, almost procedural, fitting for a man who believed systems mattered more than symbols. Yet the aftermath revealed a deep irony. His body was returned to the United States for burial, a final journey back to the country that shaped him and then expelled him. In death, borders softened where life had enforced them. The return was symbolic, not restorative. He came back as memory, not power. The legacy he left behind was not loyalty or territory, but method. The commission model, regulated conflict, distributed authority, and emphasis on invisibility continued to shape organized crime for decades. Law enforcement, too, adapted permanently, targeting structures, finances, and patterns rather than individuals alone. Luciano's life thus became a case study in modern power: how it forms, how it hides, and how it survives removal of its creators. The final lesson of this story is not about glamour or dominance. It is about systems. Luciano understood earlier than most that chaos could be organized, and that organization could outlive anyone. In the end, he did not escape the consequences of the world he helped shape. He became subject to the very logic he perfected. The man faded, the structure remained. And that, more than any myth, defines his place in history.